Welcome to the Furrowed Brow with Jeffrey Kipler.
I think people of my not necessarily my generation, millennials, but like the younger millennials that were teenagers when Obama was on the rise, it was just like this fairy tale situation. I think this is like when a lot of institutions were simply not questioned. And
It was great hope. Obama, I remember when Obama got elected, and I was definitely on the left at that point in time and had really great hope that this eloquent, beautiful, deep thinker who really this amazing presence and a black man like would figure out how to sort this shit out. And then all of a sudden he gets the Nobel Peace Prize, and a few years into the term, he's bombing the shit out of other brown people. And I was just like, what? This is not how this was supposed to go.
Look, I think it's not just one of two ways, but for simplicity's sake, you could stay in your illusion that Obama was perfect, the party did what it could, or you can go down like a pretty cynical route about just the fabric of the country, and that branches out into its own little subcategories. But I think especially when Trump got elected, I went down this really righteous, it felt good, but problematic rabbit hole of hardcore progressive ideology.
Really? So Trump getting elected kind of sparked you to go deeper into the leftist mentality. Welcome to the Furrowed Brow with Jeffrey Kipler. You want to just get right into it?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in for another episode of The Furrowed Brow. Today, I have Gary Sheng. Gary is a U.S.-based technologist, multihyphenate creator. I hope I said that word right. A civic entrepreneur who is dedicated to building and evangelizing technology systems and movements that generate hyperlocal resilience, self-sustainability, and dynamism. He was one of Forbes 30 under 30. You can find him on TikTok, where he has 133,000 followers. That's 4 orders of magnitude more than I have on Twitter. He also has a relatively new YouTube channel, Level Up America, where he interviewed my wife, Jocelynn, and he focuses on all things foundational tech. He might be the best hype man I've ever seen and got into speaking to.
Appreciate it.
And while Gary and I'm sure we're going to find out we have some disagreements on our worldviews, I've done a lot of research on Gary. I've watched a lot of YouTubes on him, both his work and where he's been interviewed. And I am beyond impressed with the journey that he's on, his thoughtfulness and sincerity, and the strength of his character. He has attributes of I want around me and on my team through this journey through life. Gary, welcome to the Furrowed Brow.
Super honored for that really thoughtful introduction.
I had to do a good hype job for you because I'm
hype up the hype
right
man.
Now.
Gotta hype up the hype man. Appreciate that. Yeah, I'm excited to dive in. It's been a minute since I've been on this end.
Nice. So I'm going to break this up into kind of 3 segments here. First, we want to just go through who you are, what your background is, where you came from. I'm hoping you might touch on where your parents came from. I want to go into the way I met Gary is through my wife, Jocelynn. And it was just at the dinner table. She was telling me about how Gary has this TikTok channel and he does all of these really kind of 1-minute explainers and how he's really good at it and got a big following. But what piqued my interest the most, and what I hope to focus the second section on, is kind of how he went from a sort of a woke millennial to, and I'm going to use Vervaake's terminology here, is to try and work through his place in this overall meta narrative from where he came. And then the third section is Gary has a kind of vision for how he wants to see the future and where he's trying to lead everybody and pointing his content at as he's trying to figure out his role in this meta narrative. So Gary, if you could just kind of give the audience just a background of who you are and where you came from.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into these 3 parts. But yeah, to start, I grew up in suburban Illinois, but I think it's always helpful, especially with what I've been focused on recently, to go all the way back to 1964 in China, when communist stormtroopers essentially came into my grandfather's home, ripped him apart from his kids and wife, threw him into a truck, and sent him to a re-education camp.
Yeah.
Not just it briefly for literally 6 years. And this is when my dad was 4 years old. We talk about childhood trauma. My dad's awesome today. I think he's gotten over a lot of that. But 4 years old to 10 years old, imagine not having a father figure in your life. Terrible, right?
Yeah.
But that put a huge chip on my father's shoulder to make it, in spite of basically the family being seen as like an enemy bourgeois to China's future. So he studied his ass off, became #1 at math in essentially his high school, got into the Harvard of China, aka Peking University, and worked really hard to get into grad school in the US at Louisiana State University, where he was able to bring my mom over. And this was a really interesting time in world history and Chinese history, US-China relations.
Oh, yeah.
My brother was born March of 1989, and this is literally right when tons of young people started to show up like every day in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, because there was like an awakening about the importance of freedom and real democracy and economic liberties, civil liberties. So really interesting time. Just a few months after those protests initially started was that massacre that happened, when people dispute how many people were killed. Could be hundreds, could be thousands, but doesn't change the fact that the only reason why I'm alive is because the US government took action to allow my parents to stay in the US basically as political refugees.
And that was signed. That was HW at the time, right?
HW, yes. So there was a number of different acts. The most prominent one was probably the Chinese Student Protection Act.
Yeah.
So I was able to my parents weren't forced to go back home to China after they finished grad school, and so my family was basically able to avoid the one-child policy. And so I was able to be born. So I think about that these days pretty frequently. And I just think about what is the role of immigrant kids, especially immigrant kids from countries that are markedly different in how they operate to the US. The US is not a perfect place, but I think you'll hear me talk a lot about foundational tech, right? I think the foundations of the US still have tied for first in terms of potential to lead humanity in so many different ways.
Who's it tied with?
I don't know. I guess I'm just saying this in kind of from epistemic humility.
Sure. So
But
like first among equals in many ways. I agree with you completely. The experiment that is the United States from the time of its founding is a unique aberration in history in many ways, where it didn't come from a king, it came from a rebellion, and it had these guiding sort of principles that were, while born out of other countries, were really foundationally unique to the United States.
For sure. And there's people like to, when they're pushing a certain narrative about the US being like irredeemably racist or oppressive.
Compared to what?
I just think, it really just, it's a lot of it comes from a good place, but a lot of it is really ignorant to what's happening anywhere else in the world, really. So
it's funny. You're like kind of the second, I don't know, I don't really want to call you a refugee exactly, but my last guest, Ace Deliri, he had the same sort of comments. He came from Afghanistan, where he was a refugee and went to Canada, and it's very similar thinking along the lines of you.
For sure. And it's not like you as a white guy are asking for sympathy here, but I have almost like a privilege and a responsibility to talk about America in a certain way. It is taboo for someone like you to talk about it, especially because I can just reference my family's personal history, and it's very hard to
you get to put on the victim card and you get credibility for it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's crazy to me that is a chip that's available to place in such a powerful way. But okay, I want to get to this in kind of the woke millennial to your current vision sort of section. But so your parents came from China. Your father went to the University of Louisiana. Where do we go from there?
Yeah, LSU. My parents were in IT. They moved to Illinois at some point shortly after my brother was born, where I was born. and I had a nice suburban life. Didn't really think about America like at all in terms of just like public service.
What a blessing not to have to think about it.
No, I think people of my not necessarily my generation, millennials, but like the younger millennials that were teenagers when Obama was on the rise. It was just like this fairy tale situation. I think this is like when a lot of institutions were simply not questioned. And
It was great hope. Obama, I remember when Obama got elected, and I was definitely on the left at that point in time and had really great hope that this eloquent, beautiful, deep thinker who really this amazing presence and a black man like would figure out how to sort this shit out. And then all of a sudden he gets the Nobel Peace Prize, and a few years into the term, he's bombing the shit out of other brown people. And I was just like, what? This is not how this was supposed to go.
Look, I think it's not just one of two ways, but for simplicity's sake, you could stay in your illusion that Obama was perfect, the party did what it could, or you can go down like a pretty cynical route about just the fabric of the country, and that branches out into its own little subcategories. But I think especially when Trump got elected, I went down this really righteous, it felt good, but problematic rabbit hole of hardcore progressive ideology.
Really? So Trump getting elected kind of sparked you to go deeper into the leftist mentality?
Yeah. So the narrative was so easy to latch onto that so many of the building blocks of America, maybe its like most core foundation, were again irredeemable. The heroic.
What was it about Trump that you thought, the election of Trump, that made you go down this irredeemable sort of path?
The narrative, while there's definitely some truth to it, of essentially like remember when Van Jones said Whitelash?
No, I don't remember this one.
Oh, interesting. So like right after the election, he was like, yes, this is Whitelash. And I thought
okay. So this is like the white people's revenge for Obama narrative.
Exactly. And
Okay.
I fully bought into that. And someone that Asians are like largely ignored or down.
Oh no, you're white now, man. You're getting basketed with us.
Or downright oppressed in a way, right? College admissions.
Oh yeah, 100%. You've got to be like what, a half a standard deviation better as a Asian guy than a white guy in order to get into the top schools.
For sure. For medical school, you have to have a basic perfect MCAT. Like these kinds of things kind of go unquestioned. And because the prevailing like social culture is one of who can be more awake or woke to the injustice of the current system, you compartmentalize the fact that like the system is not necessarily fair to my people.
Yeah.
But no one's talking about that. It's almost like an inconvenient truth that you just like put to the side. And then let's all talk about these sanctioned injustice.
Yeah.
Right. And so like for whatever reason, I felt comfortable doing that. And looking back there, I think there's almost like this sense of pride that as someone that whose people were being oppressed in a certain way, wasn't focusing
like real oppression in your generation. Yeah.
Wasn't focusing on my generation's,
your parents' generation. Yeah.
No, so I'm even saying Asian people have not been treated super in the country. You look at media, like the hyper demasculation of the Asian male, also like way harder to get into good colleges. Like we said, I think just people just generally don't see Asian males as leaders in the culture. I think these things are all changing, but there was no room in the culture to talk about these things, at least relative to basically BLM narratives.
Yeah,
absolutely. Was I outraged when I saw certain cases like Philando Castile? Still think those are absolutely outrageous that even happens once.
And what is this, the Castile?
So it's just one of the many incidents where a black man is just like, the police comes up to the car and then definitely not grabbing for a gun and just gets murdered, right?
Oh, yeah.
By a cop, right? So these things are, I don't think that they're actually very prevalent, but they're all unacceptable.
They're all unacceptable, but the amount of attention that they get is possibly disproportionate to the magnitude of the occurrences.
For sure. And I can speak from experience that there is a massive incentive to inflate just how prevalent something like this is, right? And what it says about how good or bad, really bad America is. Right? And I'm grateful for, so let me explain to you like how I specifically got involved. So post 2016, I saw a call by this big woke activist to join this kind of resistance Trump type stuff.
It always blows my mind that they call it the resistance when it's like all the mainstream media and corporations all have its back. It blows my mind. But go on. Yeah.
So I mean it's like it's all kind of funny in retrospect. I was accepted among the people that applied, like dozens of people from McKinsey, LinkedIn, Facebook, Google were all in this like private Slack.
You know, you're part of the resistance when McKinsey's on your team.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, just like underdogs. Everyone's, but I got put on the social media team because I had done my social media for my own music blog that I had that was pretty successful. And there was like no direction from the leadership, and it was like super hierarchical and weird. And it was structure without leadership. So it was like, it was like the worst of all worlds. Eventually very quickly that organization fell apart. But I still had access to post on Facebook. And I was so pissed about what I was seeing about Trump and about the Black Lives Matter stuff that I just started to, I was like, okay, maybe just ask for forgiveness, not permission. And so I just started, and it turned out I was very good at it.
You're a very persuasive man.
I'm actually curious to hear more of your thoughts on that. But I realized that I had a lot of fun. It felt like a game to me of getting people really engaged and riled up. In that year, this page that I helped create and single-handedly ran went from 100,000 to almost 1 million followers.
It's a big deal.
1 billion impressions in 2017.
You've got a business.
I don't know what the main guy was doing. I'll be selective about saying what I think I want to say. But I was lucky to have been working at Google while I was doing this and took $0 from this. This is something I genuinely believed in, which is why I don't feel so bad about what I was doing. But the reason why I stopped doing that was not because of my own like self-awareness. It was because my ex at the time, my girlfriend at the time, was like, yo, you're not fun to be around anymore.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Yes. And so
why did she say you weren't fun to be around anymore?
Because I was just scrolling Twitter angrily every day and just talking about how shitty America is. So
yeah, you're this privileged Duke student who is
working at Google in New York City, essentially angrily tweeting every day.
Right? Angry at the world. Yeah.
And I just stopped being as fun. So comparison between who I used to be, which was like I had thrown 24 parties and concerts during the time that I met her.
Yeah.
Like electronic music parties. I had a small stage at a festival once. I became a very different person because of ever since Trump got elected. And it was hard for me to give up posting on this account that I built up, but I realized I was just like wondering, what was this actually doing? I did not feel confident that what I was doing in terms of the negative psychological effects on people that were consuming the content outweighed. I did not feel like the benefits to society were clearly happening to justify the damage psychologically that the polarizing content was doing to them. And I had a very specific case study within myself of what the content was doing to me.
Yeah. It's funny. I think it was around 2015, 2016 when Trump was getting elected. I had this like really, I ran my own Facebook page. That's the limit of what I was doing. But I had a realization that the algorithms were making us fight against each other.
Yeah.
That it was this like anger amplification thing. Yeah. And I sort of just got off of Facebook because I was getting into fights with friends and family over stuff. And it was an anger amplification mechanism. And it really, I wasn't using it well. Like I was falling much victim to the same sort of thing you were doing at a industrial scale.
World-class outrage creator. Totally.
Okay, so you have this epiphany. I am the greatest like troll, anger generator, attention getter there is in this space right now, maybe tied for first in some way. And where did you go with this next?
I just cut it out cold turkey. I was like, this is
Nice.
bad. This is bad for me. This is bad for the country. And I was just like, I don't care what whoever does what with this page. Like, you can do whatever you want to do with it. Ultimately, without being too specific, the person that ultimately owned the page just monetized it
Yeah.
in a way that was like pretty gross. But
Yeah, fuck that guy.
and that also opened my mind to the idea that like, okay, maybe you got to be very suspicious about whether you think that you're a good guy, you're on the good side, or whether there is a good side when it comes to
Okay.
stuff.
Yeah, let me ask you something. What kind of philosophical mistakes do you think that you were making at that point in time, besides just being making rage for no good reason? Because you mentioned like you make it, because this is a philosophical shift that I went through when I moved from left to right, or whatever the hell I am now. How did your mindset start to vary or change?
Here's the funny thing. I am a very, as I'm sure you are as well, like heterodox thinker, and definitely cannot be neatly bucketed. But if you were to answer a basic question of is left or right more associated with personal development and hard work and responsibility at its best, right? And it's like ideal archetypes, right? It's definitely the right.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like I had during that period when I was most identified with hardcore left, my health was deteriorating. I didn't
Yeah.
go to the gym as much. I'm sure I was like literally what I was doing, posting was like blaming people for the society's problems.
You the victim mentality.
Totally. And then that just carries out into your whole life. And
Yeah.
so imagine you're dating someone who then your boyfriend is getting fatter, more irritable, and less fun.
Right.
That's like not a good combination.
Thinking he's superior to everybody else and letting a million people a day
Absolutely.
know
I
it.
mean, I was not good at taking feedback as well about how I was not super fun to be at parties anymore, and just like talking about politics whenever I could.
I've been that guy.
Yeah, hopefully you learn. But I think, long story short, what happened when I cut out that political stuff cold turkey was I worked on myself. I stopped. That was my first attempt to stop drinking. This was did I? Okay, this wasn't when I stopped drinking. Okay, but it was the beginning of a real
But you recognized you had a problem that like
era
you needed to take steps in a different direction.
to improve my life in just many different ways.
Yeah.
So I started journaling. I started to run regularly.
Mm-hmm.
I ran outside in the cold, like freezing cold, because I'm sure, have you heard of Wim Hof?
Oh yeah, my brother is really into Wim Hof.
Yeah, I just started to like think about like human potential and taking responsibility for my life, fasting, and just like a bunch of different things I started to just like implement into my life. And I just got in really a lot better shape. And I was like, okay, it's time for me to just start really thinking about what I want to do next in my life. And this is when I was like I started to discover like this thing called nonpartisan democracy reform with like ranked choice voting, open primaries,
Yep.
things I still really believe in. And so much so at that time, I was like, okay, I kind of want to create a nonprofit to train young people to care about this. And so helped launch Civics Unplugged, which is a nonprofit that currently it's just like pretty broad leadership development. But at the time, the first thing that we kind of tried was like a deep focus on democracy reform.
Yeah.
Turns out kids really didn't care that much, which is interesting. But ultimately, like it's hard to create a product that no one wants, so we had to adapt. Yeah. But I think this problem of like process changes, systems changes not being sexy to people is something that Andrew Yang with the Ford Party is going to have to figure out, because people for decades have been trying to make parties around or initiatives around structural reform, and it's happening like incrementally here and there across the country. But
have you played with the idea that democracy or the US political system is not fundamentally changeable in the way that you want to approach it?
Yeah, I don't know how much it can change. Like it's an open inquiry, really. Like that I haven't spent too much time anymore thinking that much about. which is why actually it's not out of a deep libertarian sort of impulse. It's just like a very practical, okay,
Pragmatic. Yeah. Yeah.
even if the government is more malleable than I think it is and useful, let's invest in more technologies that can serve as building blocks of the future that ideally, honestly, both major political parties want to co-op because they're so fucking cool, right? Like, okay, it's actually good for my political brand to be associated with nuclear energy or like water desalination or whatever. I think the people are really the leaders, like the innovators are really the leaders. And let's allow politicians to take some credit for things, even if they're not doing much at all relative to how hard it is to create a foundational tech company. But they're certainly not going to lead the way in charting out like a inspiring vision for the future. So that's a lot of where my mind has shifted towards. I'm really grateful for Andrew Yang and other people that have basically said, I'm just going to be it's like my brand is just going to be associated with electoral reform, government reform. But I really think that's more of like a multi-decade long endeavor, and getting young people to be less reflexive about joining like big tech or big banking or big consulting.
Yep.
Is like
These high status, high money positions that we're told the best and the brightest go to these days.
I think that's probably lower hanging fruit. And as that culture changes, and as people just kind of choose different kind of career paths, I think politicians will notice, and I think that they tend to just be followers, really. So how do you create a culture that politicians like do want to co-op, that they want their party to co-op? If both the Republican Party and Democratic Party and Ford Party and whatever else, like they start making foundational tech more part of their policy agenda, I think that is like one of many signs that the things that I care about are taking off.
Doing it in spite of them instead of through them resonates a lot with me.
Essentially, yeah. So I think there's many ways that government can be really additive to the research and development and adoption of foundational tech, but it's like a useful fiction for entrepreneurs to assume that they're not going to get any help.
Yeah,
makes sense.
For sure.
Versus, oh yeah, we'll definitely get help, and so let's bake it into our business model. I think that's a little bit risky.
What ends up happening, I think, is that when the government or any sort of political agency becomes your only customer, or your number one customer, you now work for them. You work for their agenda. You don't really have any other choice. But if you're turning down free money is also not necessarily a great path either, especially if it's with minimal strings attached.
Yeah, I mean, it's you work for the government or the government works for you, even though you are not serving the people. If you look at Sam Bankman-Fried, it's easy to pile on at this point, but it's an important case study, really. He basically bought off the Clintons. He bought off the Democratic Party. He bought off a good number of Republicans.
We're going to find out how much 40 million in protection money, along with having your mother be a major Democratic fundraiser, how much safety that buys you.
For sure. Yeah, it almost feels like Sam was playing the game of Robin Hood as well, or at least that's like almost like the best interpretation of it. It's like
he wrapped himself in that cloak at a minimum.
What?
He wrapped himself into that cloak at a minimum.
What I mean is, I almost feel like he looked down upon the crypto industry and was trying to use it to make money to then give to more worthy people.
That's the most generous, I think, interpretation.
No, exactly, right? Yeah. And that's not even like that great, because you're literally saying that like people that invested their own money into whatever they thought was investable are idiots and like bad, and that this industry is bad, and you're literally using it to do what you thought was better, which was invest in various mostly Democratic Party candidates and buying the rights to name like sports stadiums and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
So,
and it's most cynical you start to looking at it as a vehicle for laundering money that's meant for Ukraine through other sources to other sources and companies as intermediaries. I've been following this on Twitter for the last 48 hours, and it is wild, the stuff that is starting to come out about whose money is flowing where under that little umbrella.
It's pretty mind-blowing, and I'm sure that there's tons of case studies that we won't be able to get too much information about, right? Because it's now safe to reveal information about Sam because he's like the ultra supervillain, right? All these different investors and all these people that have ever interacted with him are now like, oh yeah, I had this one weird interaction. Oh, the signs were clear. But there's so much political corruption with businesses that are not actually doing that much good or doing active harm.
Yeah, have you ever heard of Rene Girard, Mimetic Desire, and the Scapegoat? Yeah, that's completely what this reminds me of. Sam was this sort of like poster child for the new wave of investing, and he used his image and connections to get all of this money, and everybody piled on because they saw everybody else piling on. And now he's becoming the scapegoat of all of it.
For sure. Yeah, so quickly rose, so quickly fell.
Like in less than a decade, like 4 or 5 years or something. He came out of nowhere. It's truly phenomenal.
His parents really understood how the world worked, or they thought that they understood how the world worked, and they did in terms of certain, here's how you get on the cover of Forbes, here's how you get Bill Clinton's attention, right? These things really matter to a lot of people, and I think there is like a large group of people that it's actually, they're right now, it just raises all sorts of red flags, which I think I almost feel like we're developing cultural antibodies against people that kind of smell like Sam in the future.
I think you might be. I mean, I know everybody's going to be duped again, but I hope and think you might be right there. I think there is such an the cycle for these scams is getting shorter. Let me bring you back to, I want to go back to your Civics Unplugged moment here with John Vervaeke, because I really like that conversation. And anybody listening should really go listen to it. What jumped out at me was one comment that you made about educating kids on civics. And the comment that you made is, why would the government teach children how to alter it? Why would the indoctrinational education system in the United States teach them really how to play the game? So I was wondering if you could comment on that. And then I want to ask you about small oases.
It's funny, like the different things I've said in the past. I've learned a lot about, especially after being in the Web3 space for a little. So it's like, where else do you learn a lot about incentives besides civics, politics, and the supercharged, unmasked view of incentives with crypto, right? Just learned a lot about it. But yeah, why would you approve curriculum that, as a government funder of civic education, that makes people too aware of how broken the systems are? This is a sort of a straw man, but I'm sure you could find textbooks still being taught where it's write a letter to your representative, as if that does anything. Right. It's one thing to like only teach so much and force people to find out information elsewhere, but it's also, I'm sure what's happening as well is just like falsehoods being taught, like fairy tale visions of how our system currently works. And that has profound negative consequences if kids have an intuition that this is bullshit, right? And so like, instead of feeling empowered by your civic education, you're just like, this is propaganda and I'm just never going to vote, or I'm never going to try to do something else that could make the country better.
So what did you mean when you talked about building small oases and then scaling those?
I think there's this understandable obsession with scale in like Silicon Valley, for example. You get VC money if you have tons of new customers signing up every day. There's a lot of that temptation in the nonprofit space to boost your metrics of like how many people are in your alumni network, etc., so you can get more money per head. It's understandable, right? It's nothing I'm saying that's crazy surprising. When you think about like the transformative experiences, the transformative groups of people that you've been part of, they tend not to be, you're not like thinking, oh, like I was part of this 1,000-person program, like all 1,000 people had a huge impact on me. What if it was like 100 people or even 50 people or even 30 people, that like there was like a really curated environment that made sure that every single person there was feeling like they were seen, valued, and supported in their development. And again, I think there's this temptation. If okay, let's say like you did the 30 people for like a year and like it
Yep.
went really well and all of them did amazing. And someone's like, hey, yeah, you should scale this. Like you should make your program 300 or 3,000.
Right.
And the problem with that is that it is because of that intimate small oasis size that the program in the first place worked. So why like all roads kind of lead to media for me is, and why I also kind of want to talk about reality TV, which actually relates a
Please.
lot to this. But
We can talk about whatever the hell you want to talk about, Gary.
part of why reality TV is so inspiring to me, and it sounds like ironic that I would say anything like that, but it's not because a random like dating show is, I think, is a huge positive influence on the world. It's like there's models that can be applied to mimetically inspiring people to see to replicate what they're seeing on camera, right?
Yeah.
So the small oasis idea, it's find the most canonical, like the best example of whatever kind of education, let's say, that you think teachers everywhere should be trying to emulate. And it's like tricky because then you'd have to like train the people that are getting educated to like not go crazy because cameras are around you. But let's assume that they somehow figure that out. If you could somehow capture the magic of a transformative educational like container in a way that is really inspiring to the world, you could imagine many thousands of teachers hosting their own 30 student oases and maybe even connecting across teachers through some kind of digital learning environment.
I think there's real future to that idea. I do a lot of thinking about educating kids and getting them out of the indoctrination system of your public education. You know, because I got a daughter now and I'm hopefully going to have more kids, and I don't want to hand the education of my kids over to my enemies. And what you're talking about there really resonates with me in terms of a model that is both humble in its original scope, but has a plan that it could also have legs beyond your small start.
For sure, because, and this is, I think this fixes, I think it's really important to be suspicious about people who have a brand that's, oh yeah, I don't care about money. I just really care about doing good. I don't care about attention. And yet they're on camera being interviewed. I like attention.
I'm doing this for a reason, for personal interest for me and my family. I make no bones about that I enjoy this, but there's intent behind it beyond just a public service.
For sure. And so me being kind of like ruthlessly self-aware and honest about like why I do what I do. It's, yeah, I want money. Yeah, I want attention. Yeah, I want to do good as well, of course.
Yeah.
But like I'm a human, and I also just, if I was a teacher like in this hypothetical environment with the reality TV shows, that might make it worth it for me because I get the recognition that I could then monetize in the future in some other ways. But like right now, does someone that could be like an investment banker or Google engineer, do they want to be a teacher to 30 kids? Right now, they have like very little incentive right now. So how do you sweeten the deal to get the best fucking teachers to be in this reality show, like this like superhero academy thing?
Never thought of it that way, but that's a very interesting idea. But you're exactly right. And Jordan Peterson talks about this quite a bit, where you can get the best guy to teach Plato and Aristotle, right? And everybody can see him and benefit from that.
For sure. And these are not simple things to pull off, but yeah, like this idea of not losing the magic of the small, but then also scaling in a way that's not conventional in terms of scaling. I think that's really interesting, and I think we have all the technology I think that we need to pull something like this off. I'm sure there's tons of startups that are like they're thinking about stuff like that.
There's Synthesis School. I know Joe Norman is part of that. I know that Jordan Peterson has some stuff going on with that, putting online schools. Yeah, I think there are people working it. It becomes, I believe, a problem of how do you package these different offerings together and utilize them in the environment because every group of 30 kids is a little bit different. You're going to have different needs and wants and what have you. I doubt there's a universally right answer for every group of 30 kids for any given age. And
for sure. I do think though that having like literally like almost like a reality TV show of a really good example of teachers and how they would interact with students and make them better, gives like this shared case study library. So let's say you and I are educators and we both watch the same show. It's, oh wow, what Mr. Smith did for Evan to deal with the conflict between Evan and Jill. Oh, I'm seeing that happen with my own kids, and that was a really good reference point for me.
Yeah, I wonder how you like. So Jocelynn loves some reality TV, and I like it too every once in a while. But one of the things that the problems that they run into is producers engineering outcomes in order to have good TV. I wonder how you mitigate those types of effects in an environment like that.
You're saying it should be interesting.
You're making an entertainment package
Right.
to an extent, right? And how do you mitigate the idea that we're going to induce Billy to have a problem that he's magically going to overcome, and it's going to make this great magical moment because Mr. Smith is going to bring him a popsicle at the right time?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but one thing that comes to mind is I think the premise of the show has to be like pretty challenging, or the purpose of the school has to be really like ambitious, and there's an inherently a lot of challenges that they have to overcome, right? The teachers for how to create the right curriculum for, let's say, a bunch of gifted kids that think very differently. Maybe there's some like a number of neurodivergent type kids, and it's not easy to make sure that the kids play well together, right? Yeah, I don't know. Ultimately, it has to be interesting people in the show, for sure. That all have like a lot of, they're like agentic people that like want to accomplish their own goals and the collective goals.
Gotcha. Cool. Let's turn this over to your more robust vision overarching for the future. So Gary is what I would call like the optimist, where he has a very positive view of the future and what is achievable through technology, organization, and inspiration. Now, he in some of his writings that he has shared with me tries to rebut the doomer point of view. And I'm what I call a doomer optimist in this sort of a model. I believe that life is going to get worse for most people before it gets better, if it gets better at all for most people. Specifically, the optimization supply chains have created an incredibly fragile system. Is likely to fail in unpredictable ways. Energy availability, which grew by orders of magnitude, lifting billions out of poverty for the past 200 years, is likely peaked from a growth perspective. But here's what makes me an optimist, and that's my doomer half. Despite the coming difficulties, I believe that I can lead and my friends and family can come through these difficult times and adjust. And the adjustment and the ability to deal with new problems in a local sort of way, where we make the necessary lifestyle and cultural changes, will thrive regardless. But so I wanted to preface that where we're going with that I'm going to be kind of criticizing from that point of view, but I want to hand it over to Gary now. Tell me how awesome the future is going to be and how do we get there?
So I'm like, I don't know how important it is for me to label the kind of person that recognizes things are going to get worse. Like I agree, right? I am.
Oh shit, maybe we're the same then.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm too far from, or I don't even know where I would disagree with many doomer optimists, but I think it's going to be a rough transition from a hyper globalized world to a much more like regional or national type supply chains and everything.
Okay.
I think
that does not come through in your writings.
It doesn't. I guess when you look at that like manifesto that I sent you,
yeah,
there's a lot of things I could say that I don't need to say. It's
okay.
It's commented on the document with a ton of random beliefs. Like I could include what you said. I don't disagree. Yeah. I think things will probably get very bad for most people in the country, many if not most people in the country. But 10 years from now, I just think that culture changes so fast that you just never know how much like momentum there is for foundational technology. Maybe I should qualify that a little bit more in my writing. I don't know. But yeah, I think that I think that it's not even just a matter of getting rid of stagnation. It's a matter of avoiding collapse. And I think
so it becomes, how far does something collapse, right? I think listening to you now, I think we both share the recognition that the system is overly fragile and really has some potential to stop functioning in the capacity that it's functioning. It's how far down the rabbit hole does lack of energy for people go? How little clean water is there? Kind of things like what kind of food supply chain problems do come around, and how good are the mitigating effects? And all of those things might vary by region in my particular estimation.
Here's my thinking on it. People will, if they had to pay a lot of money to survive, that they would, right? And what does that do? That creates a huge market for survival. Water desalination, right? There's not a lot of water in the southwestern United States anymore.
Yes.
But like that, what does that say about the market for technologies? Of course, governments can be very cronyistic about what technologies that they sanction and adopt, even, right, just because of politics. But like the market is for ensuring that the future of agriculture and fresh water just for human consumption is huge, and it's gonna grow. I think like the massive pain that a lot of people will feel as we adapt to like ecological changes, as we adapt to aquifers draining and like rivers drying up, etc., it's going to be painful. And I think, but like certainly to me at least, it feels like 5 years post a crisis, there will be so much talent that's being poured in to certain issue areas that we're kind of systemically prepared for. Like we just kind of change society to be able to now just pool water from the ocean to grow our almonds now, instead of just relying on the Colorado River or whatever. Yeah, I think it's going to be a really tumultuous decade, but who's working hard behind the scenes? It's like all these people that don't get featured online and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it like that smart professor that actually care about their students working on top issues. If there's like a huge drought in one or more states and many people die, like you don't think that they're going to talk about that in their innovation classes? Like that's certainly what I would do. I'd be like, yo, figure it out. And if I was a billionaire and I could donate to some kind of university to increase research in a certain area, I would do that, right? Or to create my own research institution outside of academia, like a lot of what like Eric Schmidt's doing and etc. I think that even though government is often pretty bad at responding to things, I think really smart people and really rich people outside of government will probably respond a lot more swiftly than we might think, or maybe we didn't even think about it. And I would love actually some case studies here on this, on what I'm saying. But you don't think that if you think that
I think back in the 1980s or so, the EPA, for example, did great work cleaning up rivers, cleaning up smog. There is precedent for collective action under a government umbrella with private partnerships to do very good work. Now, I think I talked about this in my second episode with Jason Bradley. It just became that these monstrosities just couldn't, once they did all this good work, they just kept doing more work and kind of overstepped their authority.
For sure. I think it's always helpful to put on different hats, right? Like your
for sure
humor hat, then optimist hat. So when we put in the optimist hat, you're like thinking about like now there's a normalization of even private companies cutting out half of their workforce, right? Of course, you sympathize with the people that get cut, right? Of course.
Yeah.
It's tough. But great. That meme is now being normalized. Let's apply that to government. Imagine entire agencies being cut.
Oh man.
Or it's like you have a month. It's like, hey, I just got elected. Let's say it's President Desantis. Hypothetically. I get, look, you think that Biden's second term or like Newsom is going to fire like half of an agency or an agency? No. It's going to be, my prediction is that it's going to be a Republican president that's able to create great efficiencies in government, right? To rebirth the government. Yeah, imagine like DeSantis, right? Just like you have a month to justify the existence of your agency. And actually, I'm going to create some voting mechanism for the American people. I have a ton of ideas. You should hire me, right? Okay, you produce a report. We're gonna create a system where you have to prove you're a citizen, and then like the whole country is voting on whether this agency should exist anymore, right? Based on this report. Imagine that. I literally just thought of this right now, but I don't think it's like for someone that actually wants, for someone that's not culturally pressured against changing, questioning the institutions, you're so empowered, right? Because you have this growing, like I say 70% of the country they may not identify as like a Republican, for example, but they're just like, I don't trust the system. And like this process that this new president laid out makes a lot of sense. They're giving this agency a lot of opportunity to justify their existence, right? And then with democracy, they're voting on whether it should exist anymore. Or maybe there's 3 options, like 50% of the workforce cut, 70% of the work, or all of it's cut, right?
So a referendum on federal government employees.
And it could be agency per agency, so it's not just blowing up everything, right? And so we're just like, yes, it's like the best case scenario for the agency, if it actually really is awesome, is wow, the American public now knows of this awesome agency and there's more trust in government, at least in this particular regard. So if you have nothing to hide about what you're doing, and sure, there's like some exception with like black projects or whatever, but like
I think it was Senator Schumer once said about the CIA and NSA, you don't fuck with them because they have a million ways to get at you.
For sure. So I think we can be practical here of just being smart with your life if you're the president. But like there's so many ways for the American people to feel like the government is not just serving itself, and do it in a way that actually appeals to like this sense that our democracy has died, right? Okay, if it's died, let's put out more things to a vote instead of, you know what I mean?
But how do you, okay, with interest rates going up, you have, I'm not sure you're aware of this or not, but like the interest payment on the national debt is now approaching the size of the military budget. It's becoming one of the highest lines in the federal budget. And my observation about democracy has always been that people generally will vote themselves more stuff, but they won't vote the taxes in order to pay for it. How do we resolve that in this case?
Yeah, I don't know.
Or do we just hyperinflate our way out of it and pick up the pieces after the budget defaults?
Yeah, I don't know. This is definitely not my area of expertise, but storytelling is a big part of what I think about. And
you're an expert storyteller. And actually one of the things that really jumped out at me when I was listening to your John Vervaeke interview was how good you were at telling the story of educating kids, and it really struck me about how that seemed to be just a perfect vector for you in terms of your talents, is like inspiring people to educate children. And I don't know if you have teaching experience or not, but like that just seemed, you just seemed like such a natural there talking about.
For sure. So I mean, I definitely didn't go to education school, but like,
yeah,
I can.
Yeah, I don't think that teaches you to do what you do anyway.
I think I can think from first principles that about like certain things. I'm sure that education school doesn't teach about, oh, you should be inspiring, right? There should be inspiring, because it would be hard for the students to do that because they're kind of like self-selects a certain kind of person. But I want to go back to the national debt thing, because
Please.
I almost feel like there needs to be more transparency with like economists, et cetera, about how even though financial system feels more objective numbers, it's like the reason why the US dollar, one of the reasons why the US dollar is like still treated with so much reverence is because the stories of other countries is worse,
way worse.
So yes, the national debt number feels scary, and we should but it's scary. And part of how we improve the story around it, whether or not the interest payment rate can go down by that much, is we change the culture around government, where it's like all of a sudden there's different terms. It's like, let's say irresponsibility is the y-axis, has gone up, and it's okay, this new president is like turning it finally. And so it's almost like, just like how the market booms, even though like when inflation goes down by a tiny bit, even though there's still a lot of inflation, it's like people pay attention to like second derivatives or third derivatives of like certain numbers, right? So if like the rate of the debt increasing goes down, not necessarily the debt increasing, the debt could be increasing by a shit ton, but it's like the rate of increase
Right. I mean, that's how Biden has been packaging his commentary on inflation recently.
So it's like no, it's all bad, right? Inflation at all is or just the rate of inflation is right now is like very high, right? But they're going to comment on the second order of it, and that is misleading. But yet it is clearly very powerful for people because it affects where they put their money, which is like their most prized thing, right? So if all of a sudden you have this real check on the growth of the administrative state, I actually think that would have a huge boost of confidence about the integrity of the US dollar. Again, I don't know what the fuck do I know, but what I do know is that when it comes to like an Argentinian, the average Argentinian buying US dollars versus their Argentinian peso is not an economist. Yep. But they'll probably be hearing stories about whether America is becoming more trustworthy or not, or more responsible or not with how they're spending their dollars. And they care about inflation all of a sudden. They care about not just printing a ton of money all the time. What our leadership and the policies that they put in place have everything to do with the stories that we can tell about ourselves as a country. And it has a real effect on our economy.
Interesting. Okay. So you are within like the DAO, DeSci communities. Are you a cryptocurrency or Bitcoin kind of guy?
I support Bitcoin. What your question is just about?
I was just wondering because I know you're involved with DeSci through Jocelynn, and you're part of one of the DAOs.
Yeah, I'm a contributor to Gitcoin DAO, which supports all sorts of cool initiatives in Web3 through its quadratic funding rounds that have happened historically every quarter. DeSci was a new round that was introduced, and a good amount of money was distributed to projects like the ones that Jocelynn is involved with. Definitely not super involved.
You guys were supporting LabDAO, I imagine?
So the way that it works is Gitcoin is not supporting any organization directly. Has created this like money distribution protocol where like ordinary people like you and me can decide where matching funds get sent. So it's like a coordinating like structure.
Gotcha.
So 10 people donate $1 to one project and 2 people donate $10 to one project. The one that has more small dollar donations might get way more matching funds, right? It's like basically this algorithm that allocates like money that Vitalik puts in because he wants that money to be distributed across popular projects.
Gotcha. Okay. What do you think Gitcoin does best, or what is its biggest accomplishments?
So one thing that it's done really has had I think a really positive effect on shaping Web3 culture, which is very associated with just like hyper financialization.
Yeah.
Gitcoin is Gitcoin, all the employees there are very focused on making a positive impact on the world and seeing how crypto can actually even be useful in like ecological regeneration. Although that whole sector within
regenerative finance
is very nascent. And I think there's a lot of potential, but we'll see. And then like DeSci is another one that they're just like, yeah, these are all good things that are happening. All these different experimental scenes within Web3. Gitcoin has really promoted these things and distributed a good amount of money, like tens of millions of dollars to these like early stage projects. Some of them eventually get VC funding. And then, so it's almost like the pre-seed investment, you get it from Gitcoin, just like
pre-angel investment.
Exactly. It's a lot of people tons of early stage projects depend on Gitcoin's funding rounds to sustain themselves as they basically figure out how they can sustain themselves in other ways. And then the other thing that it's doing is it's building decentralized protocols that allow for anyone to host their own grants rounds without Gitcoin's help. So that's like a longer term future.
So do you have any particular Gitcoin funded projects that you're particularly interested in seeing results in a year or 2, 5?
Yeah, I think it's less about, for me, any one particular project. What I'm most excited about is the Let 1,000 Flowers Bloom.
Gotcha.
Kind of philosophy where it's really hard to know who's going to have the tenacity and has the right idea.
Yeah.
sick. Even the ultimate irony is that even Gitcoin, right? Will Gitcoin survive this bear market, which could last for another 2+ years?
Yeah, who knows?
And so I think everyone has to have a lot of humility, including the organization that a lot of people like Gitcoin, that a lot of organizations really respect and rely on.
Cool. So is there anything else you want to talk about, what you're working on, or your vision for the future, Solarpunk is, or what have you?
I was definitely a big proponent of Solarpunk for a few months. I really liked the aesthetic, and I think I'm like a synthesizer, so I really like to take this from here and then this and here, and it's okay. How can we turn that into something that like an intellectually honest philosophy that like oh I'm this, right? And Solarpunk, I think there's a little bit too much on the anarchist and even communist influence.
Yeah.
And I'm
so
like,
how could you describe Solarpunkism for everybody?
So just like with any like philosophy, there's different people that think it's something, but one of the most popular documents is it's a document written in the anarchist library where it articulates what Solarpunk is. So I'll read a line. Let's see. Okay, so at its core, Solarpunk is a vision of a future that embodies the best of what humanity can achieve, a post-scarcity, post-hierarchy, post-capitalistic world where humanity sees itself as part of nature and clean energy replaces fossil fuels.
Oh yeah, that's definitely some commie shit right there.
It's something that it's like very idealistic. It's like almost clearly not written by someone that's like run an organization.
Yeah, the hierarchy thing jumps out at you real quick, right?
Yeah, it's like you're not going to get anything done if you don't have any hierarchy. But yeah, take inspiration from where you can. I think that it's weird. It's weird to even think. Anytime I'm like writing out like visions and like basically building out new philosophies, I'm just like, who the fuck am I to do this? But then I like realize that. Then I realize that like some of the most popular philosophies are pretty bad, right? Or
yeah.
So it's like, how do you? It's like there's a gap, right? Okay, if I'm not going to do it, someone's got to do it. And I think there's also just as there's a great, I almost feel like a responsibility given my story for why I want to create an evolutionary sort of philosophy that like does take from a lot of the philosophies that I've rejected.
Yeah.
So I think the messenger really matters. And for whatever reason, I think that I could be a good one.
Oh, I think you're an excellent messenger. I consider myself a synthesizer also. And I think I don't really think there are that many new ideas. And that's okay. I don't really have any original ideas, but I do think it's important for every generation, every person of a particular background to have somebody who is arranging these ideas in the language that people are familiar with.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Thank you. That's a good articulation of that.
And it really is important. And I think we burden ourselves quite frequently with the aspiration of originality. And I don't believe that's that important. The synthesis itself coming from you is necessarily going to be original while still necessarily being reminiscent of all of these other. We stand on the shoulder of giants, which is absolutely how it should be.
Absolutely. Yep. I appreciate that. No, that's exactly that's a great way to look at it. Yeah. Anytime I just feel like not courageous enough, I just remember like from first principles, like this makes sense. Like this, the worst thing that could happen is that it doesn't get as widely adopted as I would like. But this is like the worst case scenario, even if it's really just like, has been an exercise in articulating what I believe. It's great. Now I can point. It's like instead of just having to ramble to someone about what I've been, it's like they can read it, right?
Yeah.
It's like, are we on the same? It's like, are we lying?
And it's even the simple fact that guys like you and me, and you touched upon this in your conversation with John Vervaeke, the dialogos, the conversation and exchange of ideas, it helps you work things out in and of itself. And it's like, a man never steps in the same river twice because it's not the same river and he's not the same man. And that's what exactly these conversations do. It's where we are trying to figure out how we are going to articulate these ideas, what works, what doesn't, and having this sort of ongoing dialogue. You're 29, right? If you even had the inkling that you had figured out a life philosophy at 29, I don't think I'd want to be talking to you because that would be a pretty pinnacle of hubris. So 44, I am still struggling with these things, and I plan to keep on struggling with these things because if you're struggling because you're still doing work and it's an important work, and you have the humility not to think that you have the answer yet.
But also the confidence to know that many of the dominant philosophies are very problematic.
Oh yeah. So is there any that you would like to talk about that? Because that's, I will tell you, the problematic dominant philosophy is the main theme on this show.
I don't know. I can even just point out like a meta, like a through line across problematic philosophies. It's lack of willingness to engage in idea exchange and to be self-critical, self-aware.
And that's one of the things that impresses me about you so much is, I mean, even when I jump into, hey, I'm going to be critical, I'm coming from this doomer optimist thing, you're like, yeah, I kind of agree. I just don't like framing it like that kind of thing. You have a particular willingness to engage in a true search for truth that is refreshing.
Yeah, I guess here's another common like critique I have about dominant philosophies. It is like compromising the truth for profit to kind of speak to an existing deluded audience, right?
Yeah.
When I talk about like advising, and it could be I would be honored to advise any sort of president, right? But like when I talk about advising like a Republican president, I'm not endorsing almost anyone, right? In the Republican Party. One thing that I try to avoid, although I don't always succeed, is like saying this person's good, this person's bad, this organization's good, this all bad, right? The thing that I'm pointing to when I talk about the Republican Party probably being the highest potential to actually make government more efficient is not saying, oh, Republicans are good. I'm just seeing things for what they are. There's one party that is increasingly unified with how things are, right, and defending it. And then there's another party that's like, that, whether it's ironic or not, identifies as the rebels now. And so if we can agree long term that someone should create a culture and processes for like creating increasing efficiencies within government agencies, potentially eliminating government agencies, sometimes creating new ones that are needed, right? Being very interrogating of what should be around, it's going to be the Republican Party. I'd be happy to be proven wrong, right? I'd be happy to be pleasantly surprised by Biden tomorrow being like, it's time for us to really run a tight ship in the government. It's not gonna happen, right? It's not gonna happen. I think people should not completely write off entire parties. They should not just fall in love with entire parties and be like slaves to them. They should, I'd say, like the foundational tech space that I want to help manifest. And I'm not saying that there's so many companies that I would consider foundational tech. I think there's a lot of power in a space realizing it's a space, a scene realizing it's a scene, like individuals realizing that they should be connected to a bigger movement, right? So they actually have political influence, right? Because government regulations do affect how much foundational tech can be created.
I wanted to run away from the world for a bit of time. I thought I was just going to escape and get over all of it, but I don't think that's really possible so much.
So it'll be a really interesting one thing that you can't. I almost feel like Twitter is like a mirror to what's happening in the world. It's very chaotic. And I'm also literally saying the organization of Twitter. So the social media ecosystem and then the organization, they're both mirroring what's happening in the world, which is very chaotic. And it's also extremely entertaining. And there's also an extreme amount of opportunity for people that do not get caught up and just join like a random mob that forces them to relinquish their free thinking abilities. And
yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. The ability to independently state your ideas without feeling like you're going to be punished by the mob is very important.
Punished by any mob, really.
Yeah.
I think it's important for people on the quote unquote to have self-awareness that they get triggered by stuff as well. And
sure.
they it's almost like if you identify with an inability to be the mob, like you're gonna have more likelihood of being the mob. Same with SBF. Like if everyone's telling you that you're gonna be like Warren Buffett except better, and past presidents are just singing your praises, I think I love that this is a case study now, right? I love it because it really just it's so rich with relevant themes and motifs of our day, of like establishment consensus about this organization and this person is good and we should listen to them. And yeah,
paying off the Clintons, paying off the Democratic Party. His father is a tax expert in like tax shelters for Stanford as a lawyer.
It's so funny. So it's like every elite institution got on board, like in one way or another.
Tom fucking Brady got on board.
Gary Gensler's former boss is the CEO of Alameda's father, right?
Father, yeah.
Like the incredible amount of conflicts of interest here. And I'm glad that eroding trust in government, it's like we need better government, right? We need more accountable government. And this is yes, both parties have been extremely corrupt over the past many years,
but the Democrats are way better at it.
The union of big media, big sports, big Hollywood, big banks, big consulting, big tech, and the Democratic Party, like all having the shared consensus, is a huge danger, right? What?
It's an unbelievable monstrosity.
It's very dangerous. And I am the last person that would excuse the sins of the Republican Party, but it's what's important is to understand that these parties are shells, right? Entities that they're malleable, except the Democratic Party is less malleable because it really is there's so much pride in this like institution, right? It's almost like the Republican Party, it's like this malleable thing that also has ballot access everywhere in the country.
Yeah.
But there's no consensus on what it is.
But seemingly not mail-in ballot access.
So it has my critique, and I support people, absolutely. I support people starting third parties and nonpartisan reform. I'm a huge fan of that. The practical thing is if you want to rise in power very quickly, it's you recognize that the Republican Party lacks identity and leadership, that lacks a consensus about what it is, creates a huge opportunity for someone like DeSantis to remake it. And the thing about, I guess the final thing I want to say is when you have such a strong control over a party, you can also, like, you've gained so much trust with a voter base like DeSantis has, you can shift the views of your super followers, right, in a positive way, right? And so he's actually already invested in the environment in Florida. I don't know if you knew that.
No.
He's invested I think hundreds of millions of dollars, right, in climate adaptation stuff and stuff that you'll never hear reported, really. But imagine him doing that on a national scale and in a way that's like really practical too. It's not just doing research into far out technologies. It's Texas is like whatever, like coastal cities around the country are going to go be submerged if there's not federal help. We're going to do that, right? We're going to protect people's property, right? There's a way to get people on board with acknowledging that there's climate changes without sounding like John Kerry. You know what I mean? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, I think I think there's a lot of opportunity with, I don't want to put labels on myself, but like disaffected former partisans that really understand like how you might be able to message to both the Republican base and at least like moderate and center left type people. So it's going to be a really interesting decade. And I'm really excited about people realizing that they need to be in charge of their own lives and that they should stop kind of outsourcing their trust, making like their own lives better, and to other people, because you get again and again you get duped.
Yeah, man. 100% with you on that one.
Yeah.
You know what? That might be a good closing thought for it. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about or say?
I guess I'm just excited about a meme that I think is really unifying, which is foundational tech. And
you want to give them your best pitch, man, for investment foundational tech on your way out here?
Yes. So how I define foundational tech is technology that can greatly enable, preserve, and accelerate human or planetary flourishing. It's technology that can serve as foundational building blocks of a radically more resilient, self-sustaining, and dynamic America. It's not saying that government is not needed. It's not saying that regulations are not needed. It's not saying that we shouldn't help the rest of the world, but it is saying we should get our own house in order. And let's all agree, actually, that America has a long way to go. So instead of just complaining about it, let's build a system that is like always working in the way that we want it to work. And this will unfortunately challenge industries of outrage that love it that things don't work right now. But so I guess that's like the first time I thought about who would not want this. People that kind of secretly want things.
I love watching you work this through as we talk. It's awesome.
Yeah, this is why Vervaeke and I was so drawn to Vervaeke and why we had such good conversations, is because I do get a ton of value from dialogos because I actually care about the truth, right?
Oh yeah, no, I could tell you're a man who is struggling with the truth, which is awesome.
You know, what's funny is that I don't know if I mentioned this in any of my interviews, but I have aphantasia.
Is that like where you see colors or something like that?
No, I have the opposite of that. I can't see anything in my brain.
You don't picture stuff or have an inner dialogue or anything like that?
Those are not necessarily tied together, but I also don't have the inner dialogue. And so why, like, the dialogos thing to me is magic to me, because it literally just like, none of what I'm saying is prepared except like the definition that I read just now. Like, it's all, and why I have such an instinctual distaste for politicians that just like sound nice but are kind of full of shit, is because I couldn't memorize a speech if I wanted to.
So now I feel like I have so many more questions.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So
it really does affect my worldview.
I've heard of people that have that condition. I just have never I don't know if I'd ever met one before you. So when you look at a book, you can read it, right? Like, you're not reading it out loud.
Yeah, I can read it. I have the opposite of photographic memory. It's in general, it's hard for me to have, like, I memorize very few quotes, right?
Sure.
You have friends like, oh, Francis Bacon once said, well, it's like, I can't do that. Or I'd have to really struggle for that.
How did you do computer programming?
It really was like, it helped to have good tools where you could find the file that you needed to edit. And like, I think there's just more, and it's probably only easier and easier, but I have an interesting brain where I have to be really immersed in whatever I'm learning to be able to get into this flow state that is not even conscious necessarily, right? So when I was like the fastest promoted, I definitely wasn't the best, but I was like, but for whatever it was, I was like tied for first in terms of like fastest promoted Google.
Super successful, right? It's not easy to get the job you got at Google.
Yeah, and I was shipping like a shit ton of code because I just like, when I was literally like it sounds weird, but it's like it became like a part of me because I would just.
You're going through loops of sorts then. Like, that's the only way I can imagine it working, where like you're reviewing what you're trying to do, you're reviewing the code, and you solve the differentiation or something like that, like just through continuous loops like that.
Yeah, just it's really helpful to be uninterrupted and just working, in a way that enables me to even be in a flow state. But
if I say picture Clifford the Big Red Dog, you don't come up with a red dog in your head.
I can't see my parents. I can't see myself.
Wow.
Which is also interesting.
When did you realize that this was a thing, that you were different somehow?
This was like 5 years ago. maybe 5-6 years ago.
So this is in your adult life you've realized this.
Yeah, very recent actually, and it helped me explain a lot of things, like why I can be like it, to not be self-conscious when I'm like at a party or something. There's other things that you have to get over, but what I realized was like a lot of people would be imagining what they look like, and I can't, right? So just it would help me to not have to worry about that.
Like
And
when
like,
you're pausing though and looking around, what are you doing?
what do you mean?
Right there, you're just like,
Oh yeah,
I would.
yeah.
You're pausing. It looks like you're thinking. What's going on?
I'm just that ideas are going through my brain, but there's no audio visual component to it.
I don't even know how to imagine that.
Yeah. Yeah, imagine that.
Yeah, I don't wow, huh?
So
Is
look,
there a way you can contextualize what it is to you though? How you experience thoughts then?
yes. Let me see if I can pull up something like I've written about it. Okay, it's very helpful for me to have routines that I guess speaking of loops, right? I really rely on why it's so natural for me to think about processes and where processes are defective, because I'm so dependent on them. So every week I'll go through the same things. Like, okay, answer this question, answer this question, and I'm like, I almost have like software for my own life, right?
Yeah,
Because otherwise I'd be relying on my own memory of, okay, how do you plan for this coming week? And so I'm like, I'm cataloging all these different things that I think are useful for me in the future. I have lists of so many different things, like products that I encounter, book recommendations. I'll never remember a book otherwise that someone says, like in a conversation. I usually take notes on almost every important meeting that I have, just so that I can reference it. It's like, okay, when's the last time I met John, right? And what did we talk about? I can go back on that.
but like when I prompt you on what you said during a conversation with John, it comes up to you.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a lot I could say about how this affects like what I am doing right now and why it makes sense that I'm doing what I'm doing relative to a hypothetical version of myself that didn't have aphantasia. I can't not be like authentic, because whatever I do say, like even literally what I'm saying right now, it's just coming out of my mouth. Like, I'm not seeing like a script and like editing in real time. Like
during this conversation, I'm contemplating different avenues that I can go down with you and what the potential consequences and what might work well and what might not, just to make it a good conversation. I'm trying to pay attention to things like how frequently I interrupt you versus let you keep going kind of thing. Are those things that, what does that bring forth for you when you hear that?
So I almost feel like there's if I want to be conscious of something like that, like how many times I'm interrupting, how long am I speaking, I'd have to like set an intention to do that. And okay, yeah, I don't know. I think social interaction was definitely a challenge when I was growing up, and it's definitely not the easiest thing for me, especially when there's like multiple people in a room.
Sure.
Because, and that's not, I'm not going to just blame that entirely on like aphantasia. It's like just how different people's brains work. But I think what helped me, I think what I tend to prefer and what works well for me is being is like doing enough reps of whatever I want, however I want to perform, in almost like a manual way. So if I'm analyzing like a tweet and like thinking about how this would be received by different people, like across the political spectrum or something, I'll do that manually, and then over time my brain will just automatically like it's almost like a program that's like red flag or not, whether this would be well received or not by all these different audiences. I'm not seeing like a table of check mark X. It's just like happening, and like I'll have, if I want to, I can list it out on paper and be like, yep, my intuition was correct. What the intuition, which was a product of doing that hard work initially, worked out. Well, it's often very hard for me to, it's like impossible for me to follow multiple threads of conversation at the same time.
Yeah, multi-threading is very different. Like that's, most people don't do that well whatsoever. But it's like, it sounds like it also will be challenging, like listening to somebody and coming up with a thought at the same time.
Yeah, that seems right, I think.
Huh. Okay. That's yeah. It's funny because one of the things, like, I'm the opposite of that.
I'm really bad at. I think I'm really bad at multitasking.
Yeah. Most people aren't as good as they think they are at multitasking, right? Nobody's really good at it. Your brain typically, but it's like, I know Ace pointed this out in our last podcast with him. It's like, I have a very hard time shutting off what's the inner dialogue and the processing, even while we're having a conversation. Like, I do a little bit of both at the same time. And when I'm listening to somebody, that inner dialogue is almost always running and doing comparisons and what have you, processing in some way, like generating ideas based upon what I hear. And from what I'm hearing from you, like, that's just not much of a thing that you do.
Yeah, I've been told I can be a really good listener or a really bad one based on whether something else is on my mind. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and we all do that to an extent, but yeah.
I think it is like particularly extreme for me.
Yeah. I'm not doubting you, by the way. Yeah. Like, I can kind of observe it, like, a bit. Like, it's not what you're saying doesn't surprise me. It's only surprising in the way that I've never had that explained to somebody by somebody who experiences it before.
For sure. It's been such a helpful exercise for me to think about what this uniquely suits me for. I even created, this is actually kind of funny and you can definitely edit a lot of this because some of this is kind of boring because I just spent a lot of time saying nothing. I created this game called Our Magic Within, which had no intention of starting as a game. And it's a very simple game, but I just sent it to you.
Cool.
But it sprouted from me being really interested in like how my brain was different from other people. I think that's so important for people to think about, to understand how they're different from other people, because you are uniquely suited for different things.
Yes, very much.
So I have friends that like can do UI design in their brain.
Yeah.
I couldn't do that. Like, I can somehow do is, again, like, how would I even describe it? What I can easily do is be like, yeah, this branding and this storytelling is really good, and it's very compelling, and that's something I can do, but just like looking, right, and oh, this art is really nice.
Yeah, I don't have nearly as much of that. It's not as yeah, not in the same way other people who are good at that do. I wonder if that's why you're so good at these scripts and 1-minute explainers, because like when you bang those out, when you listen to them, it's like those are crisp. Those are really good.
Yeah, every single word is carefully chosen. Yeah, I mean, it's because like my brain is like considering the alternatives like in real time when I'm like typing it out. Okay, this could be worded better, because I like the game of forcing it to be in a minute as well. And I just know that just from experience that this is just not something that people are often good at. And so it's okay if this kind of stuff is needed, then and you kind of enjoy it and you think it's valuable for the world, maybe you should do it more. And so I started to collect all these different questions, and the listeners might be interested in what kind of questions. Okay, can you remember numbers easily? So people that are in finance, like, you better be able to fucking remember numbers easily and just do calculations in your head. I can't do that. Can you conjure up in front of you
object rotations?
Object rotation. Yeah. Can you imagine? Okay, you're Beyonce's stage designer. Like, you better be able to in your head. Otherwise, you're probably not the best to do that, because some people can do that, right?
Yeah.
I met this person the other day who was saying that she really loves designing the interior of her apartment. I'm like, okay, can you like almost be like a bird and look down upon our conversation right now? Because I knew that she could, and not everyone can do that, actually.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of this woman? I'm trying to remember her name, but she's like autistic. She does work with designing things that cows and bulls and stuff go through while they're going to be processed, basically.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And she's it's like Grandel Templeton or something like that. I'll have to look it up. But it's like what you're
like in a relatively ethical way.
She says she's on the spectrum somewhere, and she's clearly a little odd. But like, she, for some reason, like, all these big companies hired because she's able to get into the mind of the bull, and she designs these systems that just work for these.
I believe it. I
Yeah,
believe it.
yeah. That just was what it reminded me of. I think you might want to check. Grandin Templeton, I think, is the name.
Look, I think autistic people, I feel like I'm mildly autistic, honestly. Like my brother brought it up for the first time 2 years ago, and it's just, oh wow, maybe that's
I
a
wouldn't
thing.
guess that, having spoken to you. I do. It doesn't
Well,
surprise me to hear your brain works a little bit differently than most people's from how you were describing, but I'm no, what do I know?
okay, I don't know. I don't even care. I don't even necessarily care. I just know that I think the more important thing is that people's brains work very differently,
Yeah.
and we should not have. We should take advantage of that. You should take advantage of that for
Yes.
yourself and recognize that it might surprise some people to be like, there's some for almost everyone. For certain kinds of careers that you do, it's like almost no one can do what you do, even if they tried.
Yeah.
So you should pick the ones where you have this unique advantage in.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, for sure.
Some people have like more talents, like that's like the luck of the draw. Like you, like a random or not so random thing like my family history puts me in a really positive position
Yeah.
to be an advocate for America. And so you start to really just understand like who you are and say, okay, if I were to design like video game characters, because a lot of people can't really get out of their own body. Like the ego so tied up, and it's like, okay, imagine like you were designing like a video game character. Would you have them play the role that you're currently playing right now? It's actually kind of feels off. So what else
Yeah.
should they be doing? For example, there's people that like they can recreate, like they can just they can imagine like their favorite meals, and they can smell the meal, they can taste the meals, right?
Yeah.
And so culinary sort of professions could be really good for them, right? It's similar. And also like there's some people that can reimagine any smell, and then they can even combine smells. And so what does that sound like? Someone that can make perfumes, right?
Yeah.
So there's so many different dimensions of how human brains work. And
We all seem to have these like unique emergent properties that they're similar to others, but are just us, that you need to try to fit into the right role for you in life.
100%. And it's always a work in progress. But I think one of the things that I like to do with this game whenever I do play it with people, it's just literally just asking questions like this, is helping them appreciate that there's a lot more to understand about themselves, which is like fun. And then it's also differences are cool, right? The differences are really valuable, right? So there's like there's like more pathological ways that you can talk about diversity, but there's so many different elements of diversity across us, right? That are so much more than the pigmentation of your skin, right?
Oh, completely. Like it's one of the most short-sighted, myopic ways of viewing the diversity of people, is some sort of projection about the shape and color of your body, like in very uninteresting ways.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. What is it? Any final thoughts?
Any final thoughts, my man?
Final thoughts? Yeah, just grateful that you reached out. This was helpful. I will say, yeah, like the fact that we scheduled some time today gave me some more motivation to actually clarify what I was thinking. So those 2 documents that you read, the beliefs and then the manifesto.
If you want me to publish them, I'll throw them up on the site. I know you've got a bigger audience than me anyway. You don't need me to get things around.
So it's really good to just talk it through, right? And that'll test it. These will all ultimately evolve. And that's actually kind of a funny thing where I've already evolved so many times. How could it possibly evolve? It's like always going to evolve, right?
Yeah, and you're always picking, I think, a heck of a lot differently from what I did when I was in my 20s, but it's not as though all of the things that I believed were wrong. It's like sometimes it's just a point of emphasis, or it's just one thing for example, I used to think that you needed essentially like much higher taxation to pay for things, and that you needed progressive taxation in order for people to be more alike and have more in common so they got along. Well, the problem came when it's true that people get along with people who are more like them, right? That's the tribalistic thing. But the idea of attempting to engineer that through financial manipulation isn't necessarily correct. And the idea that like we're all of a sudden going to have a much more equitable society because of some centralized financial engineering. That was wrong, I believe. But it's not like all of the ideas. You just have to recombine them in a more useful way.
That's a great point. I think that's a great way to wrap. Yeah, it's interesting kind of looking at the last, it's almost 30 years of my life. I'm at this like really interesting point where I really do understand so much of like youth culture and also have a decent amount of some wisdom that I want to really double down on and try to create something that can be attractive to many different kinds of people.
Well, I think you've definitely got your finger on the pulse of some things, and I'm glad to have you on my podcast as an ally, I hope, moving forward. And I hope you feel free to reach out anytime you want to talk about anything, either on camera or off, and sort some of this shit out together.
Awesome, Jeffrey. Appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
Hey, Gary, take care, man. Thanks a lot.